Welcome. I'm Peggy Shapiro, the National Director of Special Projects for Stand With Us. This evening started with a dinner at my home with some Hindu leaders in my community who were seated around my table, and naturally the subject turned to our children and grandchildren. I was taken aback to find out that students of Hindu Indian origin faced discrimination and negative stereotypes about their religions and historical homelands. Both in the classroom and on the quad, false narratives about Hinduism prevailed. And we began, and this was in the classroom and with professors. Some students even fell for the pressure and rejected what they once treasured. And parents are often confused about what they can do. So tonight we have our first ever Know Your Rights for concerned parents of Hindu and Jewish students. I would like to introduce our panelists, Samir Kaltra, Esquire, Managing Director of the Hindu American Foundation. He holds a Juris Doctorate from Santa Clara University School of Law and is licensed to practice law in California. Mr. Kaltra is co-legal counsel at the foundation and has worked on a range of legal advocacy issues, including religious accommodation, First Amendment rights, hate rights, Hinduphobia. He worked with the FBI and Department of Justice on community Know Your Rights presentations and conducted cultural proficiency training for law enforcement. He also oversees the foundation's programs and policy advocacy initiatives and has led international human rights fact-finding missions, advocacy campaigns, and served as a panelist at multiple congressional briefings on human rights in South Asia. Mr. Kaltra has authored and submitted formal testimony and comments for dozens of congressional hearings and policy bodies on hate crimes, as well as foreign and domestic policy issues. Yael Lerman is founding director of the Stand With Us site of legal department, providing free legal resources to anyone confronting anti-Semitic, anti-Israel activity. Yael coordinated a team of 4 staff attorneys and over 250 pro bono attorneys. She is a graduate of Columbia University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa, magna cum laude, and is a Truman finalist. She attended NYU Law School, where she served as the senior articles editor at the NYU Journal of International Law and Politics. Before joining Stand With Us, Yael worked at a law firm of Boyce, Schindler, Flexner in New York and the ADL's National Legal Division. She is based in Los Angeles. I turn it over to our distinguished panelist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peggy, for this warm introduction, and namaste, shalom, and good evening to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. In our session tonight, we have a very exciting program. We are all going to get the chance to learn about using legal tools in order to enforce your rights. At the Hindu American Foundation and Stand With Us, we stand up against anti-Hindu, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and anti-India activities. Tonight, we're going to start by discussing your rights as students and what you can do as parents, and how you can use those rights to stand up against anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia. This presentation is tailored specifically for college-age students and their parents, and the issues you will face or might hear about from peers, in the news, or on social media. And feel free, as we go on through the presentation, to type any questions that you may have in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. We have also designed parts of this presentation to be interactive as we go along. And finally, we will be offering CLE credit for those that are interested for this program, and we'll be putting a link into the chat window below. Next slide, please. Or first slide, please.
And while that's coming up, I'll just thank you so much, Samir. Thank you, Peggy. I will just add that if you're the parent of a high schooler, this will definitely still be applicable. And please, any questions that people have afterwards, if we don't get to answer them, Samir and I will both put our email addresses into the chat box so you can follow up with us at any time. We're here to help anyone who needs.
Great. Thank you, Yael. So let's learn a little bit about our organizations very briefly. The Hindu American Foundation is an education and advocacy organization focused on educating the public about Hindus and Hinduism and advocating for policies and practices that ensure the well-being of all people on the planet. Since our inception, we've made legal advocacy a core area of our work, and myself and our executive director are both legal attorneys on staff, and we work on a range of issues, providing legal resources to the community, as well as providing services. We've worked on issues ranging from religious accommodation to religious discrimination, hate crimes and bias to Hinduphobia, and defending fundamental constitutional rights of free exercise and the separation of church and state. Gail?
And stand with us. For those of you who are unfamiliar, we are an international nonprofit Israel education organization. We have two main purposes. One is to support Israel through education and to fight anti-Semitism. I am the director of the legal department specifically, and this department, which is a division of Stand With Us, empowers students and community members through a legal response to anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity. And since both Samir and I are lawyers, that's what tonight's presentation will be. It will be a specifically legal focus looking at these issues. Next slide, please. And because we're both lawyers, we have to add a disclaimer in there. What would be a CLE legal talk without a disclaimer? We want you to know that we are both 501c3 nonprofit organizations with an educational focus. So we are not here to give legal advice. If you would like legal advice, please contact us at a later time. Thank you. Next slide.
So what are the goals of today's program? First, to educate. We want to explore the legal issues that most frequently arise in respect to being Jewish or Hindu. Second, we want to identify. Learn when you may want to reach out for legal help. Third, document. Understand why it is so important to take and keep evidence. And finally, empower. Be empowered to reach out for legal help should a legal issue arise. And I do want to make a really brief note here that while we're going through the slides, some of the examples may seem like they only apply to one community, but the laws apply to all these situations. So please do engage throughout, even if a specific slide or example is dealing with a community that you're not a part of. Next slide, please. So let's start a discussion today by looking at Hinduphobia. While this term itself is relatively new and only now gaining traction, the specific actions, attitudes, and behaviors that represent it go back more than 1,000 years. So what actually is it? Now you can see some examples of some common themes here on your slide, but the definition is very specific. It's a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Hinduism and Hindus that manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. Now the complete range of Hinduphobic acts extends from microaggressions to genocide. Hinduphobic projects include the destruction and desecration of Hindu sacred spaces, aggressive and forced proselytization and the propaganda that goes along with it, targeted violence towards Hindu people, community institutions and organizations, and finally, ethnic cleansing and genocide at its most extreme. Next slide, please. Increasingly, Hindu Americans see Hinduphobia in the media, in high school campuses, college campuses, in the workplace, and beyond. In particular, Hindu students on college campuses are on the front lines and face hostile and in some cases unsafe environments. Proudly identifying as Hindu or celebrating Hindu holidays often has negative repercussions, as does challenging what I like to call illiberal political agendas of professors and fellow students on issues dealing with India and Hinduism. Take for an example, the recent case of a female Hindu student who came to us and told us that she was threatened with disciplinary action by a student organization's faculty advisor at a university. Now, what was her crime? She simply expressed her concerns that a campus event promoted an anti-India political agenda on the issue of Kashmir and whitewashed the brutal ethnic cleansing of more than 350,000 Hindus from their native homes in the Kashmir Valley by Islamist terrorists in 1990. Unfortunately, her story is not isolated. And in most cases, Hindu students are fearful of speaking up in the first place, for fear of discrimination or being ostracized. In fact, vocal Hindu students and faculty are targeted and frequently accused of dual loyalty, being bigots or extremists. Some other brief examples include at Rutgers, where legitimate expression of concerns from students has been labeled as right-wing or supremacist or extremist or fascist. and attacks on Hindu holidays of Diwali and Holi, and regular Hindu practices are becoming increasingly common on campuses. The intent is to scare students into silence and not wanting to talk about or share with others or explore what their identity means to them. Next slide, please.
Now let's turn very briefly to modern US anti-Semitism. I think many of us are more familiar possibly with what is anti-Semitism. And so I'm going to make my talk on these slides very brief. What modern anti-Semitism tends to look like is from both far left and far right political agendas. It can be in person, it can be online. Students in particular are experiencing it mostly in person, even in a lockdown scenario. This was a quote that my own daughter overheard in her high school. She was in the bathroom and she overheard kids saying, "I would never be friends with a Jew." We are seeing mainly students experiencing anti-Semitism in a personal way, like we haven't seen in generations in America. What we're going to learn in this presentation are specific examples of how one can be empowered to fight back and how Stand With Us is here and available to help Jewish students do that. Next slide, please. A recent survey of anti-Semitism on college campuses recently found that most incidents in the last year took place in person, not online, which was surprising. Specifically, 72% of incidents that were studied took place in person, despite many classes being virtual. And most of these incidents took on classical forms of traditional anti-Semitic tropes and the demonization of Israel. If anyone would like more resources on what is anti-Semitism, I highly encourage you to go to standwithus.com to our resources section where we have fact sheets and booklets and a lot of information on this. I'd rather spend our time today on what are our legal rights. And if anyone would like to follow up with more information about anti-Semitism specifically, let's have that conversation later. Next slide, please.
Great. And now let's delve into the intersection of anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia and the law, especially online. So here you can see the descending application of laws. As a reminder, when we do talk about campus issues, this is the hierarchy. Obviously, the US Constitution, federal laws, state laws in the Constitution, local ordinance is all apply, but the bulk of campus laws deals around the bulk of the work that we do involves using school policies and bylaws on campus to fight against anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia, whether it manifests online, in the classroom, or in the dorms. Next slide, please. So let's jump into an example or a question. Let's say that somebody asks, I have seen hateful anti-Semitic Hinduphobic messages posted by students at school. Can the school punish the students who wrote these? Now, this touches on free speech rights, which are enshrined in the First Amendment. This is a crucial area of the law for so much of our work. Next slide, please. The First Amendment's freedom of speech is a vast and powerful tool. Generally, speech is protected. However, private parties, such as private universities, individuals, can limit free speech and can do so more than public parties, such as universities and public universities and public entities such as government. Additionally, there are several nuances such as time, place, and manner restrictions that even public parties can implement. What this means is that where and when of free speech may be regulated. However, the speech itself or the content may not. These are all important tools and concepts to consider as we delve into this important yet complex topic. Next slide, please.
So let's break this down. This is a recent Supreme Court case right on this topic. So as Samir just indicated, the First Amendment to the US Constitution guarantees us the right of free speech, including the right to say hateful, offensive speech. Let's look at this case specifically. So Brandy, pictured here, was a 14-year-old Pennsylvania high school student. She didn't make her high school varsity cheerleading squad. She was upset. And so at a store after school, she posted on her Snapchat story a picture of herself with raising the middle finger and these words: F school, F softball, F cheer, F everything. She used the full words, of course. So Snapchat is supposed to make a message vanish, as anyone with a teenager right now can tell you. But another student took a picture of it and showed it to her mom, who happened to be the cheerleading coach. The school found out about it and suspended Brandy from the cheerleading team for a year for her offensive, vulgar speech. Brandy sued the school district and won. What did the school district say? They found that Brandy's First Amendment rights of speech were violated by the school district, Even if her speech was profane, and even if it was online at a store after school, it was still legal. So this is not an anti-Semitism case. We will turn to that, but this is one of the now deciding cases in this space. And there's 3 issues that are relevant to us here. First, please tell students, be careful what you put online. What goes online stays online forever and will likely follow you. Second of all, you should take evidence if you see anything that is anti-Semitic or Hindu-phobic. Take a screenshot, take a picture. Without evidence, we can't build a case. And third, most of our speech is protected, even if it is offensive and hateful. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by that? What do we mean that hate speech is protected? So there are types of speech that aren't protected. For example, defamation or inciting language, which we'll get to. Hate speech generally is protected. It isn't protected, however, if it comes as part of a commission of a hate crime, as part of a commission of a crime, in which case it becomes a hate crime. And a hate crime is a crime motivated by bias based on someone's race, religion, national origin. Every state defines it slightly differently. Let's break this down. What would this look like? Let's say someone went and put a swastika up on a synagogue. The swastika, you could say, is protected hate speech, but it was a vandalism of a synagogue. That now becomes a hate crime, the hate speech plus the underlying crime. And now this person could get a sentencing enhancement for their hate crime. Another example would be, let's say someone's burning an Israeli flag at a protest. That is protected speech. But if while I'm holding the flag, you grab it from my hands and then go and burn it, that would be larceny and arson, and that's no longer protected. That's now a crime with a hate element. Let's see how this plays out. Let's look at one relevant example. Next slide. So here are 2 different versions. If we were a live audience, I would ask you to tell me your thoughts. The one on the right top is Columbia University. This was outside of a Jewish professor's office. So there's swastikas. It says Yid, which is a derogatory term for Jews. The only office along this corridor was hers, so it was clearly directed at this Jewish professor. It's a vandalization of the building, so it's hateful speech coupled with a crime. This is then a hate crime if they find the perpetrator. I want to note that the Nazi swastika, which is a hate symbol against Jews, should not be confused with a Hindu symbol, which is not a hate symbol. And unfortunately, people often confuse the two. The image on the left, however, is not a hate crime. It's hateful speech, but it's impermanent. It's chalk on a sidewalk. So while we find it offensive, if someone did this and was caught, they could not be prosecuted for it. And when one of our students found this, what she in fact did is got a bucket of water, poured it on the sidewalk and got rid of it. No longer a hate crime because she made it disappear. Or rather, it was never a crime. No longer hate speech, she made it disappear. So again, what we're trying to convey here is that free speech and hate speech, it's a field with a lot of complexity, and the facts and details matter tremendously. Next slide.
So here's another example, and I do want to really quickly point out that what we have come to view as the Nazi swastika is actually known as a Hakenkreuz, Nazi Hakenkreuz, which means hooked cross. Unfortunately, it's come to be known as the swastika now, but it is a Hakenkreuz, and as opposed to the Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist swastika, which is sacred, auspicious, and means peace, and is used in regular practice. So thank you for making that distinction. I did want to add about the terminology of Hakenkreuz versus swastika. And similar to that example, what we see here is very clear hate speech, Christian supremacist speech that is at the on the walls of a temple. This is a temple in Kentucky that vandalism occurred a couple years ago. So here, similarly, we have an actual hate crime that was prosecuted. Why? Again, the facts are key. Number one, it's a religious place of worship for Hindus. Number two, you see the hate speech, so it clearly shows the anti-Hindu animus. And number three, there was an underlying crime of vandalism. So similar to the last one, that there was an actual hate crime committed here. Next slide, please. Now, take for example another instance. Now, this is something that was called the Hindutva Harassment Field Manual. So, for those that are not aware, Hindutva, which literally means Hindu-ness, has unfortunately, by anti-Hindu activists and others, become referred to as fascist, extremist, and supremacist. And so, this guide that was created by South Asian scholar activists, faculty members, students on various campuses, is an it's a student resource, and it's a way of fear mongering against only Hindu students. It warns Muslims, feminists, LGBTQ plus, and other students that they are at risk from Hindu students who may espouse elite Hindu-centric ideas. Of course, no elaboration is provided to explain what elite or Hindu-centric actually means. The manual also dismisses the existence of Hinduphobia and perpetuates racist stereotypes. Now, while this is very hateful, obviously, and targets Hindu students, and is dangerous, the speech itself is protected. It does not constitute a hate crime punishable by law. Now, there are other federal civil rights protections, however, that come into play when such a guide is being produced, and that was part of the basis for a Title VI complaint that HAF filed with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, because it created a hostile environment for ethnic Indian Hindu students at the University of Pennsylvania in particular. Next slide, please.
So I'm just going to quickly mention to anyone who doesn't know what a Title VI complaint is. It's similar to filing a lawsuit, but it's a complaint that anyone can file with the Department of Education alleging a pervasively hostile environment based on someone's, say, shared ancestry for being Hindu or Jewish. And if anyone wants to learn more about Title VI in particular, please feel free to follow up with either of us. I can send you a booklet, materials. We're happy to talk about that, but let's now get back to free speech here. This is another area of speech where anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia may come up. Speech can be restricted and is not protected. We just learned if it's a hate crime, but we also learned, and this is another example, it's if the speech is inciting or is found to be threatening or specific. So what was this? This was a high school out in California where I am. And the student posted the name of his high school, what he intended to do, pictures of the guns. It was seen to be a credible threat. It was seen to be specific and threatening. And so the police came to his house. It was not found to be protected speech, even though that's what the student claimed. And he did face juvenile consequences as a result. So what one can take away from this is that if there's anti-Semitic or Hinduphobic speech that shows an intent to harm, and it's specific enough that you can determine the who, what, where, police will take it seriously and it won't be considered protected speech. Next slide, please. Imminent and specific. Thank you. So this is an example in the anti-Semitic space or anti-Israel space and when it crosses the line to anti-Semitism. So this was a student at San Francisco State University who posted this. What does it say? It says, "I love this blade. It makes me want to stab an Israeli soldier." So we have a specific element, right? He's showing the blade that he wants to use. He's saying exactly what he intends to do with it. But it's not specific, is it? There's thousands of Israeli soldiers. He's not saying which one specifically. So there's a huge debate on campus. Is this protected speech or is it not? And people came out on either side. What we know is that he didn't return to campus the next semester. We don't know why. And really, this can be argued either way. I personally would probably argue that it is protected speech. It's hateful, it's awful, but it is protected because it probably isn't specific enough. Next slide.
So now let's look at a context. Let's look at an example in the context of Hinduphobia. So this is a post from November of last year that was posted on social media by a UC Davis sponsored student organization called Other Collective. Now, it created a hostile environment for individuals of Indian Hindu descent by vilifying and calling for a boycott of Diwali, a sacred Hindu festival. In the week leading up to this holy festival, Other Collective made a post on their Instagram titled "Say No to Diwali." This was in graphic essay form and provided several slides calling for the cancellation of traditional Diwali celebrations, with various lies about the origins and the practices of the holiday. Of course, it is obnoxious, hateful speech, but it is protected. There's no threats. There's nothing that is specific. Again, it's hateful. And in these cases, sometimes the best solution is for students themselves to take matters into their own hands and address it through the university system. So in this case, Hindu student groups were able to effectively bring this issue to the university authorities' attention, and the posts were taken down. But again, hateful as it may be, this type of speech is protected under the First Amendment. Next slide, please. Now here's another example. These types of Hinduphobic and anti-India events, such as something called Holi against Hindutva, where they're co-opting and attacking Hindu holidays, are becoming increasingly popular at university campuses and in some cases high schools across the country, with support both from student groups as well as professors. So this event in particular was sponsored by a student organization with support from a faculty advisor. Now they hosted events on campus inviting people from all religious backgrounds to wear black and desecrate Holi, another sacred and color-filled Hindu festival. Now ostensibly the purpose was to condemn policies of the Indian government, but obviously it again delved into Hinduphobia. Now if you look at this again hateful, again problematic, but not illegal speech under the First Amendment. And similar to the last slide, another example of student groups being empowered themselves to take the matters to the university and address it. So they were able to actually address it in a very creative way and held even bigger celebrations that drew even more people. So they basically minimized and sidelined and marginalized this type of activity. Next slide, please. So they ultimately met hateful speech with even more positive speech.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. I want to underscore that again, which is that sometimes even if there is an illegal option, it might not be illegal under the law. That doesn't mean there aren't fantastic options. Afterwards, write an email saying to them, thank you so much for this meeting. I'm confirming that this is what was said in the meeting, because I've seen more cases than I'd like to think of where administrators deny or say that it never happened and don't hold to the promises they make when they have to address anti-Semitism by students. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The slide is not working. Okay, let's do the next one. Oh, there we go. So this is just showing our website, standwithus.com, that you can go there to report an anti-Semitic incident, and we will help you. Next slide, please.
And similarly, this is our Hinduphobia website. All you have to go to is Hindu-American/Hinduphobia, and there's an option to report an incident, and there's a full form, and somebody will review it and get back to you if and when something does occur. So please, if anything does occur, here was actually very interesting. The speech was protected. The university stood behind her speech and her ability to continue to post things like this, even though it was hateful. But this actually was probably the trigger point, or one of the trigger points, her speech in opening up a hugely important conversation about Hinduphobia at Rutgers University, led by the students there, and probably for the first time getting a university to formally recognize the concept of Hinduphobia. So we actually have to thank her for helping to put that concept on people's radars. So again, protected speech, protected as an academic, but hateful speech nonetheless. But again, there are always opportunities that even if speech is legal in other ways to address it. Next slide, please.
So this is an example from the anti-Semitism side. So just to reiterate what Samir said, a professor, under the academic guidelines, a professor is allowed to say pretty much whatever they want. A lot of talk about academic freedom, that professors can say whatever they want and they can't be restrained. And that's actually untrue. There are guidelines and principles for what a professor is allowed to say and not say, and tenure has nothing to do with it. And there's actually a really interesting example at Rutgers that I can talk about in the Q&A if you'd like, of an anti-Semitic professor there who had tenure, and they found a very clever way of limiting him. They couldn't fire him, but they found a way of penalizing him for his anti-Semitic speech. Next slide, please. My high school Israel or Hindu club was denied funding for an event. I know for a fact that another student group received funding for a similar event. Is this legal? Next slide. So this now gets to discrimination. It is discriminatory, but not illegal, to treat a person or group differently than another person or group. So for instance, if I decide that I'm only going home against my children, I would be a bad mother, but I wouldn't go to jail probably. Well, maybe if I don't feed them for enough days. But anyways, it is illegal, however, when the discrimination is based on a protected characteristic. And we spoke about protected characteristics earlier when we were talking about hate speech. A protected characteristic is based on, it's called an immutable characteristic: race, color, national origin, shared ancestry, ethnicity, religion. Again, it varies by state. But if you discriminate based on one of these categories, then that is discrimination, and that is not legal. And again, this differs a little bit if it's a public school or a private school. There's more leeway in a private school. But we don't have enough time to get into all of that now, but just to know. And at the very end of this presentation, I'm going to give an example of discrimination in the anti-Semitic space and how a student successfully overcame that. Next slide.
All right, here's another question. An anti-Israel, anti-Hindu speaker is coming to campus. Can I demand that the event be canceled? Next slide, please. A good question, and we have a good example of something that occurred last year. This is something that was referred to as a Dismantling Global Hinduphobia conference that was hosted mainly at the University of Pennsylvania last year, but went across all universities, or multiple universities, and multiple scholars were involved, and professors, scholar activists, I should say, and professors across these universities. So again, whether the speech itself is protected is one thing, and as Yale very correctly pointed out, just because speech is protected doesn't mean that you shouldn't address it using existing guidelines or policies that a campus may have. So when this conference was taking place, HAF did not necessarily say to cancel the speech, but we wanted to hold the universities accountable. And so we led a campaign writing to the presidents and provosts of all the universities involved, expressing concerns and telling them to disassociate themselves from the actual event. We didn't say to stop the professors from speaking, but our concern was that the universities were putting their stamp of approval on that type of speech, which was dangerous and created a hostile environment for students. So again, we're trying to cancel the speech, but we're trying to address it under university policies and guidelines and other civil rights policies within the Department of Education. So of course, the event went on, and as we expected, it did create a lot of ruckus, and it did promote a lot of negative stereotypes against Hindu students of Indian descent. So what we did, again, was, as Yale explained what the Title VI claim is, we filed a Title VI claim with the Department of Education against the University of Pennsylvania. And we said basically that this speech was creating a hostile environment. The flyer itself was using violent imagery. You can see it are clawing out what are ostensibly Hindu men in color of orange or saffron, which is a sacred color in Hinduism. It used aggressive and hateful rhetoric in its promotions on social media and traditional media. But again, and sorry, notably, as a side note, two of the speakers that were involved in this actually have in the past promoted anti-Semitic tropes as well, including in denial of Israel's right to exist and calling Israel an apartheid state. So just so we can kind of see the connection of where these activists are coming from between their anti-India and Hinduphobia activities and their anti-Semitic and anti-Israel activities. So again, the speech protected, but addressing it through other means. And we were actually successful in getting several universities to disassociate themselves from the conference. And we have a pending Title VI claim right now. Next slide, please.
And I'm just going to mention, because I see that lots of fantastic questions coming in. I don't know if we'll get to all of them. So I'm going to just put in the chat box shortly how to reach out to Stand With Us. And I'm sure Samir will do the same on how to reach out to him. And please, we encourage everyone to send us any questions that don't get answered and to be in touch. So an anti-Semitic or Hinduphobic crime occurred. Should I report it, and to whom? Next slide, please. This occurred this past academic year at George Washington University. A Jewish fraternity house was vandalized. This is a Torah scroll, which is the most sacred object in Judaism. For anyone who's Jewish who's looking at this, it's a visceral feeling. It's very hard to see. So a Torah scroll is so sacred that if something happens to it, you're supposed to bury it just like you would bury a human. And in this case, what the vandals did is they took the Torah scroll, they poured hot sauce on it and laundry detergent and destroyed it. There was thankfully outcry in the community. The administration did a very nice job of supporting the Jewish students. The whole community came together, but hate crimes absolutely do occur. And you should report it to the police. If you're on college campus, you should report it to your campus police. If you are in the community, you should report it to your local police precinct. I can say for Stand With Us, we are happy to walk you through how to file a criminal complaint and stay on top of it and make sure that justice is served. We also work on rehabilitative justice or justice through education. We are happy to help anyone who is the victim of a hate crime. So if you are the victim of a Hinduphobic or anti-Semitic hate crime, we are happy to help you either way. Please reach out and we will help you navigate the criminal justice system. Next slide.
Now, this is another scenario which is increasingly becoming common at universities across the country. So here's a question. A university passed a Hinduphobic resolution or a policy around caste that only targets Hindu students. What does that mean for me as a student? Next slide, please. So first, it's important to note that the attempt to conflate caste discrimination with Hinduism or Hindu scriptures is one of the oldest colonial stereotypes about Hinduism and perhaps one of the most common examples of Hinduphobia. So what happens when a university tries to adopt such a resolution and policy about caste discrimination? Well, let's quickly talk about the example of Cal State University, the Cal State University system. Its student association passed a harmful resolution in April of last year, targeting students, faculty, and administrators of color, namely people of Indian descent. It was driven by anti-Hindu activists and supported by scholar activists. The resolution asked CSU administration to add caste as a protected class to the CSU's system-wide non-discrimination policies. The resolution was also passed by the CSU administration. Of course, if and when any incidents of caste-based discrimination do occur, they're wrong, and current federal and state laws, as well as CSU or any university non-discrimination policies, already cover it because national origin, ancestry, and ethnicity encompass all the various factors that can be looked at as being associated with caste. But why does it really matter? Well, given the singular association of caste with India, Indians, and Hinduism, non-discrimination policies that include caste would mark all students of Indian and Hindu descent as members of a suspect class as a matter of school policy, and it would lead to potentially monitoring and policing. And this would be regardless of whether students even knew or identified with any of caste or community. And since there is really no universal understanding or definition of even what caste is, no coherent or obvious way to recognize an individual's caste, implementation of a caste policy could require students of Indian and Hindu descent to undergo additional scrutiny, be forced to divulge a caste identity, assuming they're even aware of it, and then this in and of itself is discriminatory. So any university's obligation, it contravenes any university's obligation to support diversity and inclusion, and also violates the constitutional guarantees of equal protection and due process under both state and federal law. Now, if you see this occurring at your university, please do contact HEF. And just in a minute, I'm going to put in my contact information in the chat, as we're in the process of legally challenging some of these Hinduphobic policies at the CSU system. Next slide, please.
And this is the final story I'll share today as we close out this presentation and start the Q&A. This is something that happened this past year. So a Jewish student leader who is known as a Jewish student leader decided to go to a public meeting at his public university. I am saying this very clearly because it matters. There's a constitutional right to attend a public meeting at a public university. This was on Zoom because this was during the start of at the start of the year. We were still in lockdown, and so he went to attend it, and he noticed that he was in the waiting room, and he couldn't get out of the Zoom waiting room. So he contacted a friend of his who he knew was already in the meeting, and she told him that it was a Muslim Student Association meeting. The Muslim Student Association attendees and leaders were currently in the meeting saying there's a Zionist in the waiting room. We don't want him to join. And for almost an hour, the student was kept in the waiting room, was not allowed to join the public meeting, and he wasn't allowed to join because he was an identified Jewish Zionist leader on campus. So as we've now understood, this is outright discrimination. This violates university policies. It violates a Jewish student's constitutional rights to free expression and free speech. So he was eventually led into the meeting. The most amazing thing is that another student recorded the entire thing on her phone from the side. And so she caught the whole thing on with evidence. Without the evidence, what then subsequently happened could never have happened. What the student did afterwards is he came to stand with us, asked for legal help in dealing with this. Together, we wrote a letter to the university outlining all the numerous violations that the Muslim Student Association had engaged in discriminating against a Jewish student on campus. And after an investigation, which the university did take seriously, they've put the Muslim Student Association on probation for a year and have denied them funding for 2 to 3 years. This is a remarkable result by a courageous student who asserted his rights, asked Stand With Us' legal team for help, and won. We're very proud of him, and we're grateful to the university for taking it seriously and demanding repercussions. Next slide, please. So we just want to close by saying that it starts with you. Neither of us can do anything in our work without you coming forward and saying you want help, and you always come first. So if you want to keep your matter anonymous, confidential, if you want to make it public and be on the front page of every newspaper, it's whatever you want. What we care about is helping you and getting you the result that you want for whatever it is that you've experienced. Last slide, please. And that's our contact information. We'll now shut down the PowerPoint and open up for Q&A. Thank you.
Wow, this is great. And as I said at the beginning, this is the first of what I hope is a continued conversation. We have great questions. We won't get to them all, but please feel free to contact Samir, Yael, or me. We'll have our contact information in the chat. Srinivas asked, the First Amendment is one thing, but is it okay to allow someone to use university resources to campaign against a particular religion or group?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the example, so one of the examples that we gave about the DGH conference, the Dismantling Global Hinduphobia conference, actually that was one of our main points, was that the university through its sponsorship was using university resources. And so again, we challenged that as a violation of civil rights laws and through a complaint of the Department of Education. So it is not right. And again, oftentimes everything you need is, whether it's in federal laws or not, it will still be in campus policies and guidelines and whatever you need to address. Now, even if it doesn't get covered under the First Amendment, that doesn't mean that there aren't still ways to address it or that you shouldn't still address it in other ways. We were just making the distinction of what is technically protected speech under the First Amendment versus what can be stopped or curtailed using campus policies and other tools at your disposal. I
just want to add briefly to two things I see in the chat box and are not in the Q&A. I just want to add that everything we said applies in high school. We use college examples, but particularly public high schools, the Title VI still applies. The same federal laws generally apply. So if you don't have kids in college, but in high school, we still can enforce those rights. The other thing I want to mention is someone asked about that last story that I told just now about the student who was discriminated against by the Muslim Student Association. And do you have to be an insider to get help from either of our groups? The answer is absolutely not. The student knew to connect with us because he had heard about us, but he wasn't at that point yet affiliated with Stand With Us in any way. You don't need to be an insider or have a connection at the university to send a letter like that. And you don't need to have a connection to one of our organizations to reach out for help.
Great. We'll take another question here. Does Stand With Us or HAF have names or organizations that are censored for anti-Semitic or Hinduphobic legal cases that we've won? Is there some listing of this?
So if you go to our website, standwithus.com/legal, under the resources and headlines tab, We have a whole selection of press releases and news articles that details different successes we've had. Though I will say that about 50% of what we do is either confidential, private, behind the scenes, not made public at the student's request. So the sampling is those students or issues that have been willing to be public.
Yeah, similarly, I would just echo the same that oftentimes Hindu students have been increasingly fearful of having anything that they say regarding some of these issues made public. So we have done a lot of this type of work quietly. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of public information around some of the successful cases. We do have some pending cases, so hopefully there will be some successful results to those at some point down the road.
Great. There's a question from Vidya Sagar Garg. I probably am saying that correctly. Oh, no, excuse me, it's another person. But if an event happens locally, is there someone to contact locally, or do students, parents, or faculty reach out on a national level? What is the best way to go about this?
Is this in regard to, I'm not sure this is in regard to being worried that an event will be disrupted, or
if there's a case of, if there is something going on that deals with Hinduphobia, anti-Semitism, are there local contacts, or should someone reach out to Yael and Samir, to you too?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I would say that definitely reach out to our info line, and then we can get it to the right person. And we may have people that are in that area that can help on the ground there. But I think we want to have a central place to evaluate and make sure we get it to the right person. So just sending it to our info@hinduamerican.org is probably the best bet to start with.
Same.
Okay. Well, there are so many questions. I know that we do have a time limit, and I want to thank you for this, but more importantly than thank you, I'd like to make sure that people have the resources that they need, because I see repeated questions. Where do we go? Whom do we contact? What do we do? So if you two would be kind enough to enter your contact information one more time, so that anyone at this event tonight has the information they need. So I want to thank Yael and Samir for opening up what is a very, very important discussion for us to have. We want our students to be treated equally, to not face discrimination, and not to feel that they're isolated and alone on campus and there's no one to stand with them. So our community standing together, I think, is extremely important. So thank you all. Please keep in contact with us. Please email us. You have contact email for all of us. And with additional questions, ideas for future programs. And I want to say thank you to our panelists, Samir and Yael. Thank you for everyone for attending, and let the conversation continue. Good night.
Okay. Thank you.